be next? You see, friends, the Bible predicted that Rome would use America and would use the economic structure of the world to force the world to follow them, to obey them in religious matters. Anybody that stood in their way to have absolute financial control of the United States has had an attempt made on their life. Nobody could stand in the way of a central bank, not even some of the wealthiest people in all the world. John Jacob Astor understood that. He was the wealthiest man besides the Pope in the world in the early 1900s. John Jacob Astor knew of the plan to establish a central bank in the United States. He knew of the meetings at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia around 1907 and 1908. He knew about those, and he knew about the plan to set up a central bank in America. He opposed it. So did this other man. His name was Isidor Straus, the man who made the jeans, made millions, very, very wealthy men. They both died on a ship called the Titanic in 1912. They stood in the way of Rome's plans to have a central bank in America. They dared to visit and to express that. And there were others that opposed it too. The man coming into the screen here, Benjamin Guggenheim, along with Astor and Straus, were among the many wealthy that died on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. They all had another thing in common besides dying on the Titanic that night. And what was it that they all had in common? The Titanic 12 was Death's ship. You see, friend, when you analyze history, plans were put into effect to set up the Federal Central Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, 1906, 1907, 1908. Nothing was going to stand in the way of that, but many wealthy expressed their objection to a central bank. They were removed on the Titanic. And about 20 months after sinking of the Titanic, with very few members of Congress still in Washington because the winter break, the holiday break, Woodrow Wilson passed through the Federal Reserve Act that set up this that you and I look at today, that has brought America to such debt from which America will never recover. But the Titanic was used as the death ship for those people who oppose the central bank. Three of the richest and most important of these were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, the head of Macy's Department, and John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest man in the world. Their total wealth at that time, using dollar values, was more than $500 million. Today, that amount of money would be worth nearly $11 billion. These three men were coaxed and encouraged to board the floating palace, had to be destroyed because the Jesuits knew they would use their weapons to oppose a Federal Reserve Bank, as well as the various wars that were being planned. What lay ahead for the United States? Would somebody dare oppose the central bank? What has happened since the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913? 2¼ years after the Titanic, world began. A few years later, a graduated income tax was set up in America, and the Bolshevik Revolution could be funded by the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. The Rothschild Jesuit agent who key in setting up the Federal Reserve Bank in America in 1913 was Jacob Schiff. It is documented in history that Jacob Schiff gave $20 million in that time to Trump and Lenin to fight the Bolshevik Revolution and take over Russia.
Okay, we're going to finish up with a summary of the Titanic.
You know, Michael, I don't see the slide on my screen.
Okay, in summation of the Titanic, Pastor Bill.
You got it. Summation of the Titanic. We have J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was the man who had the Titanic built. It was J.P. Morgan Fund that funded the Titanic. J.P. Morgan had a shipping embargo. He had a fleet of ships that was called the White Star Line. And with J.P. Morgan ships, one of them was that he had built was called the Titanic. A Jesuit by the name of Francis Brown, he was a Jesuit priest. He got on board the Titanic. He took pictures of several of the wealthy people on board the Titanic, and then he disembarked. In fact, if you go back to your local library and look up the National Geographic on the Titanic of 1985, I believe it was, there's also a videotape called The Sinking of the Titanic. It's put out by National Geographic. And they talk about, on that videotape, they talk about Father Francis Brown. He was a Jesuit priest. Francis Brown boarded the Titanic, took pictures of Edward Smith, the captain of the Titanic, took pictures of Astor and Strauss and Guggenheim and many others. And then just before the Titanic started out across the Atlantic Ocean, Francis Brown got off. Edward Smith, who was the captain of the Titanic, he'd been traveling the Atlantic Ocean for 25 years, captained ships across the Atlantic for that period of time. Nevertheless, in spite of 8 warnings, Edward Smith went full speed ahead across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, friend, you think for a minute, why would a man who was so well trained and such a veteran of the Atlantic Ocean, why would he have to be told times to slow down the ship? There's only one reason why, and that was because Edward Smith had been given orders, and it didn't matter. He was told 25 times that ship was going to sink that night. Edward Smith did as his masters told him. One man named Morgan Robertson wrote about the sinking of Titanic 14 years before it happened. Go back, you can find a book called The Sinking, or let's see, The Sinking of the Futility, or it's also called The Titan. The book about it is basically the same length of the Titanic. It was on its maiden voyage. It went across the North Atlantic, and many people died on it. And the book, written by Morgan Robertson, was written in 1898. I have a copy of the book. There was a purpose for the Titanic, and that was to kill all the people who would oppose a central Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. The next casualty to the money of the Jesuits and the Rothschilds, a man named Louis T. McFadden. Probably somebody that some of you are saying, well, who's he? Louis T. McFadden was head of the Financial Department of the United States. Let's see, part of